Everyone, Cody here, and today we're going to talk about how Stephen King writes books. And I'm not going to put fancy graphics on the screen or anything. I'm just going to run through this real quick so you can get to the meat of it. Now, this video is broken down into 3 separate parts about how he writes books. The first part is the actual physical process. The second part is how he goes about it. And the third part is something that he avoids. And we'll kind of get into each one. Now, the stuff I'm going to be talking about is stuff based on his book on writing and also just different interviews I've read over the years. Now, a few years ago, I used to write, and so reading his books and this book in particular was of great help to me because it gave me some ideas of how he writes. And, you know, he's one of the best-selling authors of all time. So it's really good to see kind of how he goes about that. So let's kind of get into it. So the first part is his routine. Stephen King, when he goes to write a book, he writes every day. So, you know, I'm sure he takes vacations and stuff like that. But when he goes to write a book, he writes every day, day after day, and he writes for a certain amount. Now, I believe that he said he tries to write at least 500 words a day. And this is actually a very realistic goal because that's hundreds of thousands of words at the end of a year. So if you wrote every day and he only wrote, 500 words a day, he essentially wrote 150,000 words or so. And that is about the length of the average novel. Now, Stephen King's books kind of vary in length. And he doesn't inhibit himself on the length of the story. If he feels it needs to end short, he'll end it short. If it's a longer story, he'll write it long. He doesn't really care about writing his books about the same length as some other more commercial authors do. And either way is fine, it doesn't really matter, but he doesn't inhibit that. So that's part of it. The first part is that, he doesn't structure his length. He just lets the story be as long as it needs to be. But the second part of that is that he writes every day. So he just comes to it. He puts in at least 500 words and, he'll keep going if he feels the need to keep going that day. But if he's not feeling particularly inspired, then he'll write his 500 words and he'll stop as long as he's gotten in that 500 words. Now, here's the really important part about all of this is that he writes whether he feels like writing or not. So he has a routine and he uses that routine to kind of get through the book. Now, he even talks about it in the book about, he doesn't wait for the muse to strike. He just writes day after day. And if he just sits there in front of his computer, he'll just sit there until he comes up with something and puts it on the screen. So really, he doesn't wait for inspiration. He just puts in the work day after day, regardless of how he feels. He says that, writing a book is just like any other job. You just go, you put in the work, and then you're done for the day. And I think that's very true. I mean, it's no different than art. I paint, but you're painting, it's a product. You have to put in the time, you make the product, and then you move on to the next one. That's just life, And so, he puts in the work day after day, regardless of how he feels. And he said that he writes, even if it feels like he's shoveling crap from a sitting position, he does the work. He puts in the work and then he moves on. That's it. There's no in between. He doesn't wait for the muse to strike. He just puts in the work every day and he moves on. Some days are better than others, but that's kind of how it goes regardless of who you are and what work you do, whether you're a creative type or not. So that's the first part. Work day after day, develop a routine. So you need to develop a routine so that you can get into the habit of working even if you don't feel like it. You put in the work and then you'll feel better about that day because you put in the work even if you didn't feel like doing it. The second part of that is his actual writing process. And what I find interesting about how Stephen King approaches his books is that, if you read about any other author, there's a lot of different authors and they all have kind of their own thing. When I talk about the actual writing process, I mean the physical writing. And if you read about like Ernest Hemingway, what he would do is he'd read his whole book and then he would kind of start writing after that so that he could keep the flow of the story going. There's other authors that just don't even read what they wrote the day before. They just pick up right where they left off and they just start writing that day from wherever they left off without reading everything. what Stephen King does is he kind of rereads a little bit of it just to kind of get enough of it to bite back into it. But what he really does is when he writes his stories, he writes stream of consciousness. So when he writes his books, he doesn't sit there and focus on whether the sentences are perfect or not when he's writing the book. Essentially, his goal is just to get the words on the page. And so what he does is he writes his entire book, and he just writes it based on what comes to him so that he can get the whole book out. And what I've found is that personally, when I did this, I actually got more of the book done. So when you focus more on getting the book done as opposed to making it perfect the first go, then you progress a lot faster. So basically you have to take off the inhibitors, and you have to, ignore that urge to go back and perfect every sentence as you write it. Sometimes I don't know about anybody else that's ever written, but sometimes you get that urge, like if you're stuck and you have writer's block and you don't know what to write next, then you'll just kind of go back and you're like, oh, I'll just start editing some of this stuff while I'm waiting to be inspired again. Yeah, he advises not to do that. He just says, just keep writing. Just put the words on the page so that you can finish the story, because a written story that's not good is a lot better than a half-finished story that never gets finished. So I think this is great. This is a great idea. I fully endorse it, and I've done it myself. The days where I just focused on getting the writing on the page, I felt more productive than the days where I tried to perfect it to really just stall while I wasn't actually writing. So if you want to write, you just have to write. You can't just sit there and try to perfect everything. Just finish the entire product and then go back and, edit it later. And kind of as a bonus tip to tack onto that, what Stephen King does to edit his books is he'll finish a whole book and then he leaves it for a certain amount of time. So what I think he said in his book was that he'll write a book and then he'll scrap it, or not scrap it, but shelf it. And then he'll go and he'll work on a completely different project and then come back to the other one after some time has passed, like weeks, months, whatever. Because what that does is that detaches you from that story. So when you can get to the point where you are focused on something else, it releases that attachment of that story. Because if you're trying to edit while you're still in the story, one, you're gonna miss over mistakes because what it's supposed to say. So if you're reading it while you're still kind of thinking about the whole story, you're going to miss over mistakes because in your head you know what it's supposed to say, but they may not be what's actually on the page. So what he does is he'll finish that and then he'll go and start a brand new project and just start working on something completely different and then come back to that. And I think that this is valid advice no matter what you do. If you're a sports writer, a blogger, maybe you write stories, doesn't really matter. If you can put that away for some time, at least, days, weeks, months, whatever, so you can kind of release that attachment of it. When you come back to it, it's going to feel foreign to you, which is good because then you can see it for what it really is and not for what you think it is in the moment. So that is the second part of it. One, just write without inhibitors to stop you to try to make everything perfect right then and there. Just get everything in your head. Just, if you can, get into the habit of writing stream of consciousness, where you're just writing as the thoughts come, just get them all on the page, finish out that product, and then go back. And then if you have to rewrite it again, even from scratch, at least you got all those ideas on page, and then you can go back and make that better. So write without inhibitions, and also give it time before you go back and edit. So that is the actual writing process. So the last part is something that I think is just very smart, but it will not work for everyone. Okay? Here it is. Stephen King doesn't write with an outline, and everybody is divided on this. I know a lot of people that say if you don't have an outline, you're just going to have a mess of a story. If you do have an outline, or other people say if you have an outline, then it allows no creativity. I can't tell you which way is right and wrong, and I've done both. And I'm going to tell you the advantages and disadvantages of both from my perspective, and then I'll kind of come back to Stephen King's stuff. So real quick, I'll just give mine. So when I write with an outline, I tend to write my content faster. So when I have an outline of what I'm going to do, then it's a little easier for me to be able to structure the content because I know what's supposed to be there. But it's true that you also tend to not put in as much content when you have an outline because you are capping the creativity just a little bit. Now, on the flip side, I've also done it where I didn't have an outline and my story kind of wandered off. It tended to just kind of be this big old mess. However, you do tend to get more content out, and then if you have more content, you can always strip that out later. It's really up to you. Actually, the best thing that I found that worked for me was to kind of have an idea of what I was going to write just for that day. So I would come up with almost like a mini outline. So a few bullet points of what I was going to write that day or what I wanted to cover. And then once I hit that, and either whether it was nonfiction or fiction, once I hit those points, then I just wrote whatever it was. As long as those 3 points were hit in the story or the book that I was writing, then I felt accomplished. I felt like I was doing it correctly. Now, let's come back to Stephen King. Stephen King doesn't write with an outline. Here's what he does. And he said he has, and he's done some notes for some of the stories, but overall, he doesn't use an outline. Here's what he does. So when he writes for the story he's working on, what he does is he tells us himself the next part of the story over and over again so that it works in the subconscious. And so he'll finish for the day. He'll what's going to happen next? Okay, I want the characters to do this, but how is that going to happen? So he won't plan it out, but he'll think about it, and he keeps thinking about it. So he'll go to bed thinking about it. He even said he'll think about it as he goes to bed. What's great about this is that when you think about something before bed, you tend to dream about it. And not only that, our brain hates unresolved conflict. And I have a whole theory about that. But anyway, coming back to that, if your brain hates unresolved conflict, well, the story's not finished and you're thinking about it. So you go to bed thinking about that. So in the morning, when he goes to write, he's already thinking about what's going to happen next. His brain has had time to process all of those ideas. And so this is what he does. He just thinks about that constantly until he comes back to the writing so that he can, once he gets back to that typewriter or computer or whatever he does, he can just get right into it because he's already been thinking about it. And I'm sure he gets those ideas of what to do next. By the time he gets there, he can put them on paper. So that's what he does. Everybody's kind of got their own thing. Like I said, I would just kind of, think about the main points that I wanted to cover. And then as long as I covered those, I felt accomplished. He tends to just keep thinking about it over and over again, what's going to happen next. And then he puts it on paper, and then he does that page, and then he just does the process over and over again so you can kind of think about it. So it doesn't really matter how you want to do it. That's how he did it. That's how I did it. Whatever works for you, just go with that. But that's pretty much it. Those are the points I wanted to cover. That's pretty much how Stephen King writes a book. I really think that knowledge really helps, if you're a writer of any sort, fiction, nonfiction, doesn't really matter. But I really wanted to just put this video out there because I think it was really helpful for me. So I thought I might help someone else. If it helped you in any way, please leave a comment, or if there was anything that you do differently according to what I talked about today, leave that in a comment too. But that's it. I appreciate you watching. I will catch you guys in another video. Take care.